Ireland became a sort of a pawn or a peg in the middle when it came to British, English and Spanish rivalry for control of the Atlantic. I think it became in England's interests to ensure that this western frontier wasn't vulnerable to Spain. So they reconquered Ireland in the 16th and particularly the 17th century, and that meant the leadership cadre was taken out, like the aristocracy. They primarily headed off to the continent, to France and places, if they weren't actually eliminated. And the 19th century famine then meant that the proletariat were gone. So the community lost its leadership and its large-scale, lower level users of the language. Lower level, I mean just socially, not intellectually or anything. And the famine actually, what is it, 1845 to 52, that siphoned out about 1 million, well, death, and then about another 1 million to emigration within maybe 10 years. So you went from a population of substantial numbers of Irish speakers around 1841, the entire population being about 8 million, down to about 4 million by the early 1900s. So that's a fairly unprecedented population decline and language shift in Western Europe in that time. People who spoke Irish and did as a community language down through time had a tremendous vocabulary for features, for flora and fauna and natural features, natural landscape features. I remember when I was staying in a house in West Kerry in 1975 for a couple of months, one of the locals, who was primarily an Irish speaker, would have had words for all the insect creatures in the sand on the beach. You would be hard put to find anybody who had a similar vocabulary in English, simply because the person grew up in that environment. The same would go then for mountainside topography, for plant cultivation. People in Ring and Waterford, for example, I had a student did a PhD on recordings of Ring Irish, and there was a tremendous vocabulary relating to potato and vegetable cultivation. So it's quite likely that all of that would have survived and maybe, I won't say entered the food chain, but gave people an appreciation of what they were cultivating or eating, which I think is certainly gone. A very negative decision was taken a couple of years ago, and I got a student to write a master's thesis on it. The removal of a strand of Irish teaching in secondary school. That strand was teaching the history of Irish literature. Not the language now necessarily, but there was a component of the Leaving Cert which was what was the history of the evolution of the Irish language and who were the major writers and that type of thing. That's taken out. A very negative decision, because that confines language solely to its usage as a medium of communication rather than the key to a culture. That's thrown out, and that was very negative. I'd put that back straight away. I'd also put back the teaching of Latin, because that was removed in 1973. You needed it to get into universities. The removal of Latin has downgraded language knowledge and what the Germans call Sprachgefühl consistently for the last 30 years, and most of our students are grammatically illiterate, to be quite frank with you, and meaning no disrespect to them because they're as competent as ever, but they do not have a foundation in language terminology, which is critical at this level. Anything which gets the message across that this is inherently an interesting area and will enlarge the mind and get you to travel and that kind of thing, and the uniqueness of the cultural inheritance that we have, you know, any opportunity like that is to be welcomed, because I think the community, particularly clever people, or open-minded and enlightened people, respond to making what we have known to them.